Hi, I'm Damon Fairless. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is scheduled to be in Washington today. He's meeting Joe Biden at the White House and then speaking with lawmakers. This visit comes at a critical time in Ukraine's war with Russia. For nearly 2 years, Ukraine has depended on support from the U.S. and other Western allies. But the billions of dollars coming from the U.S. is at risk of running out, as a $60 billion package President Biden wants to send to Ukraine gets tangled up in a political tug-of-war.
This cannot wait. Congress needs to pass supplemental funding for Ukraine before they break for the holiday resources. As simple as that. Frankly, I think it's stunning that we've gotten to this point in the first place. While Republicans in Congress are willing to give Putin the greatest gift he could hope for.
Olena Zelenska, Ukraine's First Lady, told the BBC on Sunday that this U.S. aid is the difference between life and death for Ukrainians.
We cannot get tired of the situation, because otherwise we will die. And if the world gets tired, they will simply let us die. And given what is happening, this danger that the aid will slow down constitutes a mortal danger to us.
Despite fierce fighting in recent months, the front line has barely moved. Russia has stepped up its missile attacks on Kyiv in the past few days, and Volodymyr Zelensky is facing tough questions at home over his leadership. Francis Farrell is a reporter with the Kyiv Independent newspaper, and he joins me now to talk about this. Hey, Francis, thanks so much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off with money, because Ukraine is quite dependent on funding, in particular from the States. And there's I guess the potential for that U.S. funding to dry up. The U.S. has sent billions of dollars to Ukraine since the beginning of the war, but the $60 billion or so in new money that Biden wants to send to the Ukraine has been hung up now by lawmakers in Washington. So I guess my first question really is, what would the end of U.S. funds mean for Ukraine's war effort?
I mean, it's the kind of darkest question at the moment going around in Ukraine. But there was a Washington Post article about this recently, about how actually most of these funds, they don't go straight into Ukraine's coffers. They actually go to American defense companies, first and foremost, for the weapons and the ammunition that goes to Ukraine, with which obviously Ukraine is fighting this war. And we've seen this trend over time where slowly and surely stocks of Soviet-made munitions, especially shells, air defense missiles, and so on, are slowly drying up. So you see this gradual transition towards NATO weaponry, NATO caliber artillery ammunition, and so on. And that has become the bread and butter of what Ukraine is fighting this war with at this point. The availability of artillery ammunition is probably one of the most important indicators of which side is going to be able to conduct offensive operations, how well one side can defend. And I can say that if that just stops coming, it's a pretty simple equation. You know, Ukraine will have to start rationing it, and they'll have to use less and less of it. And if it actually runs out, then that's again a really dark scenario, because Russia will be able to start moving forward, and Ukraine won't have anything to hit them with. There's only so much that bravery in this sense can do for you if you don't have any ammunition.
Just last week, Biden announced that the U.S. is going to send $175 million in military aid for weapons and equipment. That's previously approved money, and it's what's called a presidential drawdown. So that just basically allows for quick discretionary military funds in kind of emergency situations. So I'm just curious, how far would that money go, that $175 million?
Normally, the scale of it is about $500 million here, or $1 billion here, or perhaps a smaller one would be $200 million. So in the grand scheme of things, unfortunately, 175 million is definitely one of the smaller packages. And I think
Mm.
Washington did say that this could be one of the last ones, actually, if this
Mhm.
extra funding isn't approved. So it definitely doesn't go a very long way, to be honest.
Yeah, and we've heard that from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken as well, just that kind of that warning that this might be the end of it if there's more funding.
They're in a ferocious battle now in the South and the East. We are running out of funding for them. By the way, 90%
Yeah,
of these
yeah, absolutely. And it's a very we're in a very strange time at the moment in general with this. We see Zelensky going to Washington now to try and make a final push to get this passed because
Mhm.
unfortunately we're in a kind of state in the war, a new paradigm, I guess, where once it's clear now that Ukraine's big counteroffensive on which so much really hinged kind of failed in the end to make a strategic difference. The conversation has shifted from one of okay, a quick Ukrainian victory or perhaps a stalemate, and now it's a question of well, we could have a stalemate. Ukraine could continue to hold the line, or if suddenly there's no more ammunition to fight with, it could be Russia who has a very simple road to victory.
And I want to come back to that, but before I do, I want to ask again about the support for Ukraine. So beyond the U.S., how do things look in terms of international support for Ukraine?
Well, beyond the US, obviously, then you have the European partners. And there again, there is trouble. I mean, Europe has notoriously kind of been complacent with their defense obligations, even within NATO before the full-scale war in Ukraine.
Mm.
And they've been caught out in the sense that now, Kiev is certainly very much dependent more on the US than on Europe because Europe just can't provide aid at a rate that matches what the US is giving. And
Mm.
again, here, like quantitatively, the most important thing is artillery ammunition, and the Europeans have just been really slow, scrambling to even start, upping production on their end. Of course, they have given a lot of important systems, so a lot of artillery howitzers, self-propelled howitzers, tanks, of course, the Leopards and the Challengers,
Mhm.
and air defense has been crucial as well. But again, when it comes, we're talking about a full-scale tussle, a numbers game between the military-industrial complexes of Russia and the West. And unfortunately, because there was so much delay in giving and so much reluctance, which is still there with some systems, to give Ukraine the really game-changing systems which it could have quickly won the war with. Now it is really down to a numbers game of artillery shells and drones and people. That's a game which is just a lot harder to fight for Ukraine and one where Russia really seems to have the advantage.
So I'd like to come back to this change in the war, but before I do, let's talk about President Zelensky. He's been a popular leader. I mean, at the outset of the war, in particular, he was kind of a rock star in some ways internationally.
From the battlefield to the bunker to meeting with heads of state. Over the past 10 months, Volodymyr Zelensky seems to have been everywhere. And it's that fighting spirit, along with Zelensky's decision to remain in Kyiv and rally his country, that made him Time magazine's pick for Person of the Year.
But in Ukraine right now, where's his popularity? How's he doing there?
Surveys have been conducted, and at this point, he still has a high rating of popularity, but it is starting to slip. And
Mm.
when it comes to the trust, that's the interesting one, where he's starting to lose in the trust ratings to the army in general, the military in general, and specifically the commander in chief of the military, Valery Zaluzhny.
Mm.
So, I mean, what we see here, there was discussion back and forth about whether or not Ukraine should hold elections, but whether
Right.
or not that happens, what we are seeing is a return of political competition, and the end of this kind of completely one-sided idea of complete political unity, and now the return of very open and very often very valid criticism towards the country's leadership.
Let's talk about some of the criticism. So, Vitaly Klitschko, who's the mayor of Kyiv, recently said that Ukraine was drifting towards authoritarianism.
So much so that he warned that Ukraine could resemble Russia in the near future, at least politically. Klitschko
and that was with an interview with Swiss media, I think. What was he referring to? What did he mean?
First of all, it's worth mentioning that itself was a very politicized statement, definitely not objective, because Klitschko himself has been political and personal rival of Zelensky since a long time ago, since Zelensky came into office, and so it's kind of in his interest politically to stir the pot, and we don't really know exactly who the main challengers will be in this new political competition to Zelensky, but
Right.
Klitschko could well be one of them. But of course, there are elements of a predominantly democratic country and society which come under threat, and potentially, usually for good reason, in the case of such an existential war for survival. And then you have to
Right.
find this middle ground where that's seen by a society as acceptable or already too dangerous. For example, you have the consolidation of television channels into this unified 24-hour telemarathon, which gives very little in terms of actual useful information about what's going on in the country. And this general idea of censorship and propaganda during wartime, unfortunately, that ugliness is starting to come more and more up to the surface now.
So we heard last month the head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny, he used the word stalemate to describe the war because it's been nearly impossible for Ukraine to reclaim much territory.
In a surprisingly candid essay, Ukraine's top commander, General Valery Zaluzhny, said Ukraine needs more Western technology to help clear mines, stop Russian drones, and to help build up its own defense industries.
And since he said that and referred to it as a stalemate, the tension between Zaluzhny and President Zelensky has been clear. So I'm curious how that relationship is being perceived in Ukraine.
Yeah, so that was indeed the trigger. And since then, we've had Zelensky reacted in an interview to The Sun. It was a kind of veiled stab, I guess, at Zelensky, saying that military people should not get into politics. And he openly rebuffed Zelensky's, I think, very clear-cut and objective observation about how the war looks at the moment.
I believe that today, indeed, the situation is difficult. I don't think that this is a stalemate.
Now, Ukrainian media, which is still, most of it is free and quite fair and objective, has started to talk about this openly, and this tension is understood to be real because it is real. You don't see them taking photos together. You see Zelensky taking photos with the next generals underneath Zelensky, who are potentially candidates to replace him, and it's just getting worse and worse. This political fragmentation does have implications for the battlefield strategic situation. Zelensky is the commander-in-chief, but Zelensky is the supreme commander-in-chief.
Going back to what General Zaluzhny said when he made his comment about the war being at a stalemate, he was referring, as you mentioned, to the stalled spring offensive, which began in June, and it was really a major operation. And there was a lot riding on it. There were billions of dollars in Western backing, but it really was quite insignificant in terms of the dent it made in the front line. I think Ukraine took something back like 500 square kilometers or something. So So I'm curious, is this seen as a military failure there?
Yeah, I think at this point everyone is more or less on the same page with that one. For a long time, while the official statements were still saying that battles and offensive operations are continuing, we were all thinking, well, maybe they're on the brink of some kind of breakthrough. They've reached this main Russian fortified line in the south, and maybe they just need one last little push. But I think by October, when we saw Russia attack with huge amounts of men and equipment on Avdiivka near Donetsk,
Mm,
it was pretty clear at that point that they weren't too worried about a Ukrainian attacking breakthrough, and it was around the same time that any progress whatsoever stalled in the areas where Ukraine was attacking, and it's worth remembering that indeed this is maneuver warfare where you break through and surround the opponent has basically come to an end in Ukraine for now.
mhm,
So when we're talking about attacking operations and gaining territory, it's really just one trench at a time, one field at a time, one tree line
mm.
at a time. It's become very, very hard for both sides.
So you mentioned that Russian forces have been focused on Avdiivka, just north of Donetsk. Can you tell me what's going on there? Why the focus there?
So Avdiivka has a lot of political significance for Russia because it's right outside, the I guess the biggest city in this Donbas region, Donetsk, and it has been this kind of Ukrainian frontline stronghold since the war between these countries started in 2014. And over time, Russia made some gains around the city, but they couldn't push through the city at all, even though it was so close to Donetsk. And now they saw this bulge in the front line, they saw this Ukrainian salient, and in October, they made a real attempt to quickly surround it, so to capture it
Mm,
in a very quick pincer attack. They sent dozens and dozens of tanks and armored vehicles to try and overwhelm the Ukrainian defense. But the Ukrainian defense held. These columns of armored vehicles were destroyed in huge numbers.
So far, the Ukrainians have repelled these assaults, inflicting huge losses on Russia's soldiers. The UK's Ministry of Defence says these are among Russia's biggest casualty rates of the war.
But the Russians only managed to advance on the north flank.
But that didn't stop the Russians. They've still got plenty of resources, plenty of warm
mm,
bodies to throw at the fight. And now what they've been doing for the last 2 months is just still attacking, but in smaller infantry groups, just like they did around Bakhmut. So you have a squad of 10 to 20 guys basically just creeping forward. Some of them they're kind of meant to die. Their whole purpose is
mm,
just to find out where the Ukrainians are firing from.
mm.
And, again, it comes down to this grinding warfare, bit by bit, tree line by tree line.
So is it essentially that we're looking at a conflict that'll just uh, be, for the lack of a better term, a meat grinder for a long time until someone runs out of will and weapons? Is that what we're looking at?
Uh, I mean, potentially that's what it has been over all of 2023, basically, if we're being completely honest. And it is an existential struggle for Ukraine because Russia has made its aim of taking the capital, basically ending independent Ukraine as we know it. It's very clear about that aim, and that aim hasn't changed. And of course, for the personalist, totalitarian country that is Russia, it's for Putin. It seems to be an existential struggle for him as well. I mean, obviously, he went through a lot. He went through a lot of humiliation. He's had to put his whole country on a war footing. He's had a coup almost against him, and he's still going for this and doubling down. So it's very hard to see how we could reach a point where one side just decides we've had enough. But I guess that's the most important thing now for Ukraine, to put the pressure back on Russia, because at the moment, unfortunately, Russia's plan of tiring out the West and just grinding down Ukraine in the way they're doing seems to be working pretty well.
All right, Francis, thanks so much for taking time to chat.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right, that's all for today. I'm Damon Fairless. Thanks for listening to Front Burner, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.